The gardener was clearing the undergrowth and stumbled upon a strange steel door. It would have been better never to see what was hidden behind it. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. Marcus had always thought of himself as a man of the earth. His hands were broad and weathered, dark skin lined with calluses that spoke of decades spent pulling weeds, digging soil, and pruning trees. For him, life had never been easy, yet he never complained. Born in a poor neighborhood where many of his friends had long since vanished into prisons or early graves, Marcus had chosen a different path. He had learned that the soil was honest in ways people rarely were. The ground yielded only what you gave it, nothing more, nothing less. That quiet fairness gave him comfort, a reason to wake before dawn, to sharpen his tools, and to step out each morning, knowing he would come home tired but satisfied. When the call came offering him a new job, Marcus felt the tug of something unusual. A wealthy investor had purchased an abandoned estate in Connecticut, and the grounds were said to be so overgrown that they resembled a wild forest more than a cultivated garden. The owner wanted the grounds cleared and restored, and Marcus was the man trusted to begin the work. It was to be a contract larger than any he had taken in years. He agreed, both for the pay and for the challenge. For beneath his quiet humility lay a pride in his craft. To shape neglected land into something that could breathe again was not just labor. It was a kind of rebirth, and Marcus considered himself a patient midwife to such transformations. The morning he first arrived, he stood by his truck and let his eyes travel across the estate. The mansion loomed at the heart of it, massive stone walls cracked with age, windows nailed shut with wooden boards blackened by decades of rain. Moss covered the roof like a burial shroud, while vines crawled the facade, gripping the house as though nature itself were trying to drag the building into the earth. The drive was nearly impassable, roots splitting the asphalt, weeds climbing waist-high in places. Statues of angels and forgotten mythic figures were scattered about the grounds, their faces smoothed by time, their marble bodies strangled by ivy. The air smelled of damp wood, mold, and something sour that Marcus couldn't place. He set to work with his small crew, men he had known for years, fellow laborers who trusted his quiet authority. The overgrowth resisted them like a living enemy. Bushes clawed at their arms, thorns tore skin, roots fought back against the blades of their saws. Marcus pushed steadily forward, machete flashing in the dim light filtering through the canopy of untended trees. As the hours passed, the sense of unease grew. The garden did not feel like a simple wilderness reclaiming what was once groomed. It felt deliberate, as though every twisting vine and every thicket had conspired together to form a curtain, hiding what lay behind. He paused often, wiping sweat from his forehead, eyes lingering on peculiar sights. A broken chain half buried in the soil, as if something had once been tethered there. Stone steps that led nowhere, crumbled into ruin. Patches of ground where the earth seemed too smooth, too carefully packed, as though someone had once walked there often. Marcus tried to dismiss the thoughts, telling himself that every old property carried its mysteries, but the idea pressed at the back of his mind with quiet persistence. As the day wore on and the men worked deeper into the wild garden, Marcus's machete struck something that rang with a dull metallic sound. He froze, certain at first it had been a stone, but the resonance was too sharp, too cold. He knelt, brushing away ivy with calloused fingers until he saw it. A surface of rusted iron, partly sunken into the earth, hidden beneath roots that had grown thick as wrists. His chest tightened. It wasn't a fence post or a tool discarded long ago. As he hacked away more of the vines, the shape revealed itself. A door, low and broad, set into the side of a shallow hillock that rose behind the house. The door was covered in rust, its edges corroded, the lock swollen with age. But the structure was unmistakable. Someone had deliberately built it there and then concealed it beneath decades of growth. Marcus leaned closer, the damp earth cool against his knees, and touched the surface. It was rough, flaking under his hand, but firm beneath the decay, as though it still guarded whatever it had been meant to protect. He stood in silence, the weight of discovery pressing against him. His crew gathered behind him, murmuring in low voices, their eyes wide as they peered through the tangled remains of ivy. But Marcus said nothing. He simply stared, the unease he had felt all day now sharpening into certainty. The estate had not simply been abandoned, it had been hiding something, and he had stumbled upon its secret. For a long while he remained crouched before the door, listening to the wind rustling through the trees and the faint drip of water from somewhere unseen. The world seemed to hold its breath, and Marcus felt as though the garden itself had been waiting for him to find this place. He straightened slowly, heart pounding, and wiped the dirt from his palms. He knew without question that his discovery would change everything. The sun dipped low behind the mansion's ruined roofline, casting the garden into shadows, and Marcus looked once more at the iron door buried in the earth. He did not yet know what lay behind it, but already he sensed that this was no simple curiosity. It was a threshold, a boundary between the visible world and whatever secrets time had tried to bury. And standing there, in the hush of the overgrown estate, Marcus realized that by finding it, he had already taken the first step toward crossing that line. The garden around him seemed to fall silent, as though listening, as though waiting. He felt it in his bones. The past was stirring, and soon it would no longer remain hidden. The discovery of the hidden iron slab haunted Marcus through the night. Even after he left the estate and returned to his modest home, its presence weighed upon him, an image that refused to fade. He could see it as clearly as if it were still in front of him, the rust flaking beneath his touch, the ivy curling possessively around its edges. When he closed his eyes, he felt again the strange hush of the garden, that sense that the land itself had paused to watch him. He told himself it was only a door, just an old piece of metal set into a hill, perhaps leading to nothing more than a collapsed cellar or forgotten storage room. Yet he could not escape the pull it exerted, a whisper in his thoughts that said there was more waiting beyond. The next morning he returned before his men arrived, driven by a restlessness that left him unable to sleep. The estate looked no less foreboding in the pale dawn. Dew clung to the tall grasses and vines, glinting like tiny shards of glass in the light. Birds stirred in the high branches, their calls shrill and scattered. But even their presence did not break the feeling that the land carried secrets best left undisturbed. Marcus walked straight to the door, machete in hand, and knelt to finish clearing the roots that still clung stubbornly to the frame. Each stroke of the blade revealed more of the iron, until at last the entire outline of the door was visible. It was massive, nearly 6 feet across, built with a weight that spoke of deliberate intention. The lock, a heavy cylinder of corroded metal, was fused shut, swollen with decades of rain and soil. Whoever had built this had not meant for it to be opened easily, and whoever had abandoned it had likely hoped it would never be uncovered at all. Marcus studied it with unease, feeling the weight of time pressing against him. The air around the door was damp and cool, the earth beneath it unnaturally firm, as though this entrance had been meant to outlast even the mansion above. As his crew arrived, they gathered to stare at it, their voices hushed, as though even speaking too loudly near it might provoke something they did not understand. They asked what it was, what he planned to do, but Marcus gave them no answer. He himself did not know. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let the new owner decide what should be done, but another part, stronger and insistent, told him that he had been the one to find it, and it was his duty to uncover what lay beyond. The decision gnawed at him throughout the morning. He cut down more brush, trimmed the edges of the garden, tried to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of labor, but the thought of that door would not leave him. At midday, with the sun high and his shirt clinging with sweat, he could bear it no longer. He called the men over and told them to bring the crowbars from the truck. Their faces betrayed hesitation, but none refused. Together they returned to the door, and Marcus knelt once more before the swollen lock. The first strike of the crowbar echoed through the stillness, a harsh metallic crack that seemed to reverberate off the trees. Rust fell in flakes, and the lock groaned but held. Marcus pressed harder, his arms trembling with the effort, until with a final wrenching twist, the corroded metal gave way. The lock snapped, and the sound was like the crack of bone, sharp and final. For a long moment, none of them moved. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as though the garden itself recoiled at what they had done. With the lock broken, Marcus gripped the edge of the door and pulled. It resisted at first, roots and years of neglect clinging to it, but slowly, inch by inch, it opened with a grinding groan. A cool draft of air spilled out, carrying with it the stale scent of damp stone and rust. Behind the door, a set of concrete steps descended into darkness, each step slick with moisture, the walls narrowing as they disappeared below the earth. Marcus stood at the threshold, the beam of his flashlight cutting into the blackness. The steps seemed to invite him, yet at the same time they repelled him, as though they were the spine of some great beast leading into its belly. He could feel his men waiting behind him, their breaths shallow, but he knew this decision was his alone. With slow, deliberate steps, he placed one foot on the top stair and began to descend. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the smell of mildew and stone. Water dripped steadily somewhere unseen, each drop echoing in the confined space. The walls were bare concrete, stained with dark streaks where moisture had seeped for years. Marcus's light revealed cracks spidering through the stone, yet the structure itself remained firm, built with a strength that suggested permanence. His footsteps were muffled on the damp stairs, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The descent seemed to go on longer than it should have, deeper into the earth than he expected. At last, the stairway leveled into a narrow corridor, the walls pressing close, the ceiling low enough that he felt the urge to stoop. The beam of his flashlight quivered slightly in his hand as it swept across the corridor and came to rest upon another door. This one was different, not corroded iron but thick steel, its surface scarred with marks where a torch had once cut and sealed it shut. The metal bore the dark traces of welding, as though someone had tried to imprison whatever was within. Yet time had not been kind. Rust had gnawed at the seams, and one of the heavy hinges sagged, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap came the same cold draft he had felt above, but stronger, tinged with the scent of dust and decay. Marcus approached slowly, every instinct telling him to stop. He reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed the edge of the steel. The chill of it seeped into his skin, a cold unlike anything from the surface, as though the very metal carried the memory of what it contained. For a long moment he stood there, heart pounding, staring into the narrow gap. Behind him he could sense his men shifting uneasily, their fear mirroring his own. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, drew a deep breath, and pushed. The door groaned, the sound low and grating, a protest against being disturbed after so many years. It opened slowly, revealing only shadows at first, the beam of light cutting through dust that hung in the air like mist. Marcus held the light steady, forcing it further into the darkness, until the shapes within began to take form. And there, as the threshold yielded and the hidden chamber revealed itself, Marcus knew with certainty that he had crossed into a place never meant for ordinary eyes. The steel door yielded at last, opening with a tortured groan of rusted hinges. Marcus stood at the threshold, his flashlight trembling in his hand as the beam pushed into the gloom. Dust swirled in the stagnant air, disturbed by the sudden breath of freedom after decades of confinement. The cold draft that spilled from the chamber seemed to carry with it not only the scent of mildew and corroded metal, but the weight of years, a chill that crept into Marcus's bones and settled there like an unwelcome memory. He hesitated, his instincts screaming to turn back, yet something stronger pulled him forward. He stepped inside, and the others, unwilling but unwilling also to leave him, followed. The first impression was one of silence, a silence so deep it seemed to pulse with its own presence. The chamber was large, larger than Marcus would have imagined from the hill above, its concrete walls stretching into shadows beyond the reach of his light. The floor was littered with debris, flakes of rust and scraps of paper long reduced to illegibility. Against the wall stood rows of shelves, and on those shelves rested boxes, barrels, and containers of every shape. The labels, where they had not rotted away, bore dates from the 1960s, numbers, and stenciled warnings. The air carried the faint sweetness of decayed wood, mingled with the sharp bite of chemicals that Marcus did not recognize, but instinctively distrusted. He moved carefully, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast room, and directed the beam of his flashlight to the nearest shelf. The box before him was intact, sealed with waxed paper tape that had grown brittle with time. His hands shook as he pulled it open, and the sound of the paper tearing seemed deafening in the stillness. Inside were stacks of documents, neatly wrapped in oilcloth. He drew one bundle out and untied the string that bound it, revealing yellowed papers covered with typewritten lines, signatures, and stamps. The language of the documents was one of numbers. Transactions, shipments, names he did not know. Yet even without understanding, Marcus could sense their weight. These were not ordinary records. They bore the mark of secrecy, of dealings meant never to be revealed. His beam swept further, revealing another table, this one crowded with old photographs and a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels coated with dust but intact. Piles of tapes lay beside it, each labeled with dates and coded phrases. Marcus imagined the voice of the man who once sat here, recording his thoughts or commands, and the idea unsettled him. It was as though the room still held the echo of its owner, a ghost preserved in paper and magnetic tape. The photographs, stiff with age, showed men in suits shaking hands, soldiers posing beside crates, ships in harbors, and the dark silhouettes of planes. Each image seemed a fragment of some vast narrative, one that whispered of power and the hidden machinery that moved nations. The deeper he moved into the shelter, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. His light revealed another section behind a partial wall, sealed with an iron grate. With effort, he wrenched it open, the screech of the metal loud in the tomb-like space, and stepped into what seemed to be a storage chamber. Here the shelves were different, lined with metallic canisters, each marked with symbols he recognized from warnings he had seen on the backs of industrial trucks. Hazard diamonds, skulls, and strange alchemical icons. Some of the containers were intact, their seals unbroken, but others bore signs of corrosion, dark streaks seeping down their sides. From one, a viscous liquid dripped slowly, forming a stagnant pool on the concrete floor. The smell was sharp, acrid, so strong that Marcus pulled his shirt to his face to breathe. Fear gripped him with sudden clarity. This was no mere cellar of rations or forgotten supplies. It was an arsenal, a place designed not only to preserve its owner in times of crisis, but to arm him, to keep at his fingertips the means of power and destruction. He remembered the welded seams on the outer door and understood them differently now. Someone had not simply tried to keep intruders out. They had tried to lock something dangerous in. Behind him, the other men shifted nervously, their eyes darting to the leaking canisters, the shelves of papers, the endless stacks of secrets that no gardener should ever have stumbled upon. Marcus could feel their unease like static in the air, but he himself stood transfixed, his light traveling across the room as though compelled to uncover more. In the corner, beneath a thick coating of dust, he saw a trunk, its surface decorated with brass fittings green with corrosion. He approached and opened it, the hinges groaning in protest, and found more documents, but these were different. Bound in leather, stamped with names and crests, they spoke of families, of inheritances, of ties that reached across oceans. He realized that whoever had built the shelter had not only feared the bomb and the chaos of the Cold War, he had woven himself into the fabric of power itself, storing proof of his reach in a vault beneath the earth. The realization left Marcus shaken. The garden above, with its choking ivy and silent statues, now seemed less a natural ruin and more a deliberate mask, a cloak to conceal what lay beneath. The mansion, with its boarded windows and crumbling walls, was not simply abandoned. It had been left as a sentinel, a decoy, while the true heart of its former master lay preserved in this bunker, waiting to be discovered. The acrid smell thickened, and Marcus felt the weight of responsibility pressing down upon him. He could not ignore what he had seen. To leave this place untouched would be to risk whatever poisons leaked from the canisters, whatever truths lay hidden in the papers. Yet to expose it would mean tearing open a wound long buried, a past that powerful men had meant to die with its creator. He stood in the heart of the shelter, caught between fear and duty, between the impulse to flee and the knowledge that he had already gone too far to turn back. The flashlight flickered briefly, and for an instant the room plunged into darkness. In that suffocating moment, Marcus imagined he felt the presence of the past itself, pressing close, whispering in voices he could not understand. When the light steadied again, It revealed nothing but dust and shadows, yet Marcus knew he was no longer the same man who had walked down the stairs. The garden above had led him to a threshold, and by crossing it, he had become the unwilling guardian of a secret more dangerous than he could have imagined. His breath sounded loud in his ears, ragged and uneven, and he knew he could not remain in the shelter much longer. The leaking canister was enough to convince him that every moment here carried risk. He turned back toward the door, his men following with hurried steps, their relief palpable as they glimpsed again the stairway leading upward. Yet even as he climbed, Marcus knew that what he had found would not release him so easily. The papers, the tapes, the weapons, the canisters, all were lodged in his mind as firmly as they were in the concrete of the shelter. He had seen the truth, and the truth had a weight that could not be set down. When he emerged into the fading light of day, the cool air of the garden felt like a blessing, though it carried with it the same uneasy hush. He looked back at the iron door still hanging open, and a shiver ran through him. The earth had yielded its secret, and now it would never let him forget. Marcus stood for a long moment outside the door, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breathing. The taste of the underground shelter clung to him, metallic and sour, as though the air itself had seeped into his skin. The others lingered close behind, their faces pale, their eyes darting between the gaping door and the silence of the garden, which seemed more oppressive now than it had been before. The ivy rustled faintly in the breeze, and the statues, once mere ornaments, now loomed like silent witnesses to a secret that had been torn open. Marcus wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and knew, with an unshakable certainty, that they could not pretend this had not happened. The shelter's existence was dangerous, not only to them, but to anyone who might stumble upon it in the future. That night, sleep refused him. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, the shadows in his small room shifting with every movement of the streetlight outside. Images swam before his eyes, the leaking canister oozing its poisonous fluid, the neat stacks of files filled with names and numbers, the photographs of men smiling over shipments of weapons, the endless shelves of tapes and reels. His mind returned again and again to the welded seams of the steel door, the way someone had tried so desperately to lock this place away. He understood now why, and the thought filled him with dread. He knew he could not carry this knowledge alone. By morning, his decision was clear. He returned to the estate, the dew wetting his boots, and made the call. His voice was steady but heavy as he explained what he had found. He spoke of barrels, of documents, of possible chemicals. He was careful not to embellish, but his words alone were enough to bring silence to the other end of the line, followed by the measured assurance that authorities would be dispatched immediately. Marcus hung up with a strange sense of release, though unease clung to him still. He had passed the burden on, but he knew it would not leave him so easily. The first cars arrived before noon. Police vehicles, followed swiftly by unmarked vans carrying men in protective suits. Marcus stood to one side of the garden as they cordoned off the area, his machete forgotten in the grass. The men spoke little, their actions swift and deliberate as they surveyed the iron door and the darkness beyond. They entered the shelter with equipment and lights, their shadows dancing eerily on the walls of the stairwell. For hours they worked, their voices muffled through masks, until at last one of them emerged to confirm what Marcus already knew in his heart. The place was a danger, not only because of the chemical canisters that had begun to leak, but because of what those documents contained. As the day stretched into evening, the scene grew. Military trucks rolled in, their insignia stark against the estate's decayed grandeur. Bomb disposal units followed, their presence a chilling reminder of what lay below. Marcus watched as they carefully removed boxes, each handled with the precision of men who knew one mistake might cost lives. Some containers were sealed and loaded into armored vehicles, others examined on site with the grim efficiency of experience. The leaking canister he had seen was lifted away within layers of protection, its surface glistening under the harsh lights. The air buzzed with tension, a mixture of fear and fascination, as specialists cataloged each piece of evidence. Among the authorities came historians and government agents, their suits crisp, their notebooks always in hand. They whispered in clusters, comparing notes, pointing to documents spread out on temporary tables. Marcus caught fragments of their words. Funding, foreign operations, political influence. The language was clinical, but the weight of it pressed upon him. What he had uncovered was not just a bunker, it was a vault of secrets, a window into a shadow war that had been waged decades ago and then buried beneath the soil of an abandoned estate. One of the historians approached Marcus during a lull, her eyes grave. She explained what they already suspected. The former owner of the estate had been no ordinary man of wealth, but a magnate with deep ties to industries that thrived in the chaos of the Cold War. He had built his fortune not only on steel and oil, but on the hidden commerce of weapons, political bribes, and covert deals that had shaped the destinies of countries far beyond America's borders. The shelter was his legacy, a hoard of evidence meant either to preserve his power or to ensure that his secrets would remain hidden forever. He had died without heirs, his empire scattered, and the world had forgotten him until Marcus's machete had struck iron in the weeds. The weight of her words settled heavily upon him. He thought of the garden, of how every vine and root had seemed to clutch the earth in the stubborn defiance, as if nature itself had conspired to protect the secret buried there. Perhaps, he wondered, the land had known better than men the danger that lay beneath it. Perhaps the silence, the sense of watchfulness he had felt from the first moment he set foot on the estate, had been the earth's way of warning him. Yet he had cut through the vines, torn open the door, and now the truth was loose again, no longer content to sleep in the dark. As night fell, the estate took on the glow of floodlights, the once abandoned mansion now the center of a hive of activity. Men moved back and forth with crates and papers, their shadows stretching long across the ruined statues and cracked pathways. Marcus watched it all, feeling like a stranger in his own story. He had come here to tame a garden, to clear weeds and restore order. But he had become instead the man who disturbed the past, who awakened the sleeping ghosts of power and greed. His name was already on the lips of the reporters who had gathered at the gates, their cameras hungry for the face of the gardener who had found history's hidden scar. Yet he felt no pride, only a gnawing unease that deepened with every passing hour. The shelter was being emptied, its poisons carried away, its papers catalogued, its shadows pulled into the light. But Marcus knew shadows never vanished so easily. They clung, stretching long and thin, following those who tried to outrun them. He feared that by breaking the lock and pushing open the door, he had let something escape that would not be contained by walls or boxes or even the careful hands of experts. Long after the trucks had begun to roll away, he remained by the garden, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of the hill where the door yawned open. The hum of generators filled the night, but beyond it he heard only the whisper of leaves, the steady breathing of the earth. He could not shake the feeling that the past had not been satisfied with being uncovered, that it demanded something more. As he turned away at last, walking toward the gate with slow, heavy steps, he understood that his life had shifted irrevocably. He had not simply revealed a secret, he had stepped into it, and it would follow him, shaping his days as surely as the soil shaped the roots of the garden he had once thought to restore. The mansion loomed behind him, its boarded windows catching the artificial light and gleaming like blind eyes. Marcus did not look back again, but he knew with a certainty as deep as the chill in his bones that the shadow of the past now stretched across his path, and that no matter how far he walked, it would remain. The days that followed blurred together, each one marked by headlines, flashing cameras, and the murmur of voices speaking his name. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm he had never sought. Newspapers printed his photograph beside images of the mansion, the iron door, and the endless boxes of documents hauled from the earth. News anchors spoke of him with awe, calling him the humble gardener who had unearthed history's darkest secrets. To the world he had become a symbol, a man whose simple labor had peeled back the ivy of time to reveal the machinery of corruption beneath. But to Marcus, none of it felt like triumph. Every time his face appeared on a screen, every time a stranger shook his hand, he felt a hollowness inside, as though the praise belonged to someone else, someone braver, someone who had not felt the same bone-deep dread when the shelter's stale air first touched his lungs. Reporters camped outside his modest home, their vans lined along the street, their questions shouted the moment he stepped outside. What had he seen? Did he know who the men in the photographs were? Did he realize what he had uncovered? He answered as little as possible, speaking only of what was necessary, repeating the same words until they lost meaning in his mouth. The more they celebrated him, the more uneasy he became. He had not been a hero. He had been curious, stubborn, and perhaps foolish. He had torn open a wound that others had tried to seal, and now the world was bleeding with revelations. The authorities did not leave him untouched either. Men in suits visited him, some polite, others stern, their questions as sharp as blades disguised in silk. They asked about the order of discovery, about who had been with him, about whether he had touched or taken anything from the shelter. They pressed for details of his impressions, his thoughts, as though the mind of a gardener could supply answers that eluded them. Marcus gave them truth, but his truth was simple. He had swung a machete, struck metal, opened a door, and descended. The rest was theirs to dissect. Yet he could not escape the feeling that by stepping into that shelter, he had stepped into their world, and now he would never entirely leave it. At night he dreamed of the garden, not the overgrown chaos of vines and roots, but something darker. In his dreams the statues moved, their marble faces turning to watch him as he walked. The ivy coiled like snakes, tugging him toward the hill. The door was always there, waiting, its steel mouth yawning open, whispering with voices he could not understand. He would wake in a sweat, the taste of rust and mildew still in his throat, his heart pounding with the certainty that the shelter had not released him. It lived in him now, a shadow that walked beside him. Weeks passed, and the estate was locked under permanent guard. The new owner had been stripped of any claim, his purchase swallowed by the government, the mansion sealed behind fences and warning signs. Yet Marcus sometimes returned, standing outside the gates with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring at the house that seemed more alive in its decay than any place he had ever known. The garden, even half cleared, had grown wild again, as if eager to reclaim the scar torn open by human hands. He would stand there until the guards motioned him away, their eyes wary of the man who had started it all. He began to notice a change in how people looked at him. At first there had been awe, but slowly it shifted to something more complicated. Some regarded him with suspicion, as though he had known more than he admitted. Others looked at him with pity, as though he carried a burden too heavy for his shoulders. A few avoided his gaze altogether, as if afraid that by meeting his eyes they might glimpse the shadows that now followed him. Marcus bore it in silence, but inside he felt the truth of their unease. He was not the same man who had walked into that garden weeks before. The soil beneath his hands no longer felt innocent. Every weed he cut, every flower he planted seemed tainted by the memory of that bunker, the reminder that beneath beauty there could always be rot, hidden and waiting. The government moved swiftly to spin the story, turning it into a tale of vigilance and historical reckoning. Public statements praised Marcus as the man who had helped expose decades-old corruption. Officials promised transparency, reforms, justice for crimes long concealed. But Marcus had seen enough of the world to know that promises and papers were only as strong as the men who held them. He wondered how much would truly be revealed, how much would quietly be tucked away in archives never opened again. The truth was a dangerous thing, and those who held it rarely let it shine in full. He had dragged the past into the light, but already he sensed it slipping back into the shadows, repackaged and controlled by hands far more powerful than his own. One evening, as the sun sank low and bathed the sky in red, Marcus returned once more to the gates of the estate. The guards recognized him and allowed him a moment, their faces softer now, almost respectful. He stood by the rusted fence and gazed at the mansion, its windows still boarded, its walls still scarred by time. The hill that had concealed the door lay quiet, the ivy creeping once more over its surface, as though nature was eager to heal the wound. Marcus watched the breeze ripple through the vines, watched the shadows deepen as night approached, and he felt a strange calm. The secret was no longer his to bear alone. It had been torn open, examined, dispersed. Yet he knew that for him, the scar would never close. He thought of his life before that day, the quiet rhythm of labor, the satisfaction of coaxing order from chaos. He thought of how simple his world had been, How pure the honesty of soil and root. That life seemed distant now, unreachable, as though he had lived it in another age. He had crossed a threshold, and the price of crossing was that he could never go back. His name would forever be tied to the shelter, to the files, to the poisons and secrets that had slumbered beneath the estate. And though he had not sought it, though he would have given anything to remain only a gardener, he had become something else, a man bound to the truth, no matter how heavy it was to carry. As the last light faded, Marcus turned from the gate and began the long walk back down the road. The gravel crunched under his boots, the sound steady and grounding. He felt the weight of history pressing at his back, but he also felt the earth beneath his feet, solid and familiar. Perhaps he could never return to the man he once was, but he could still tend to the soil, still find honesty in the ground's reply. The past had reached for him, had dragged him into its depths, but he was still here, breathing, walking, living. The shadow of discovery would never leave him, but neither would the strength that had carried him this far. And so Marcus walked on, the night gathering around him, knowing that the garden had changed him, knowing that secrets once unearthed could never again be buried, but holding fast to the quiet hope that in the soil of tomorrow he might still find a measure of peace. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the shocking stories we uncover. Watch the next video right here. It will surprise you even more. And if this story gave you chills, share it with your friends and see their reaction.